Hi guys, so today we're going to talk about two different types of behavioral learning theories. The first one being classical conditioning, and the second one is operant conditioning. So we're going to go ahead and start off with classical conditioning. That's my favorite. So basically it starts with an automatic or reflexive response, meaning that that response occurs naturally for the subject, and that subject isn't even aware that that response is happening. And so it begins with a natural stimulus and an unconditional stimulus. The natural stimulus is something that doesn't cause that reaction in the subject, while the unconditional stimulus creates that natural response for the subject. And it then turns into an unconditional response, and that unconditional response is that natural response that occurs due to the unconditional stimulus. So when we have a repeated exposure to the natural stimulus and the unconditional stimulus, that results in a conditional stimulus. And a conditional stimulus is created when a correlation is produced between the natural stimulus and the unconditional stimulus. And then, so then the conditional response is the response that occurs due to the conditional stimulus. So to sum that all up, when we repeatedly expose the natural stimulus and the unconditional stimulus at the same time, the unconditional response turns into the conditional response, because there's a correlation in the brain that happens in the brain between the natural stimulus and the unconditional stimulus, so that you get the same result with the natural stimulus, whether the unconditional stimulus occurs with it or not. So it's a pretty cool concept that gives us a little insight into how our brains work. And then moving on over into the operant conditioning, it was first explained by Edward L. Thorndike, and then it was expanded on and taught by B.F. Skinner. And B.F. Skinner created these Skinner boxes that were used for experiments on animals to produce a desired behavior. And that's kind of the whole kind of idea behind operant conditioning, is producing these desired behaviors. And so the core is really learning as a result of voluntary behaviors and consequences. So basically, you're training behaviors through the behaviors of these consequences. And then these consequences are through positive and negative reinforcements, and then positive and negative punishments. So a positive reinforcement deals with adding a stimulus in order to increase the desired behavior. And then a negative reinforcement deals with eliminating a stimulus in order to increase the desired behavior. And then a positive punishment deals with adding a stimulus in order to decrease an undesired behavior. And then a negative punishment deals with removing a stimulus in order to decrease an undesired behavior. So the reinforcements are used in order to increase the desired behavior, and a lot of the times reinforcements have been shown to be a lot more effective in transforming behaviors, especially in like kids. And then punishments are used to decrease that undesired behavior. And then as far as the positives and negatives go on here, the positive is adding a stimulus, while the negative is removing a stimulus, just to break it down a little bit more for you. And then a couple more aspects of the reinforcement and punishment sides are dealing with the adversive stimuli and the appetitive stimuli. So adversive stimuli has to do with the positive punishment and the negative reinforcement, and that is the unwanted consequence that comes along with the positive punishment and the negative reinforcement. And then for the appetitive stimuli, that is comes with the positive reinforcement and the negative punishment, and that is the rewarding consequence that comes along with those behaviors. And then lastly, for operant conditioning, there are 4 different types of, time frames, I would call them, for these reinforcements that we have been talking about. So those are the fixed ratio schedule, the variable ratio schedule, fixed interval schedule, and a variable interval schedule. So for fixed ratio schedule, we have the subject gets their reward after a set number of responses. So say every 10 times a behavior is done, you get your reward. Or every 5 times, you get your reward. It's very consistent like that. And then when we go to variable ratio reward, the amount of responses needed in order for the subject to receive their reward varies. So there's not that consistency that we get with a fixed ratio schedule. We could do every 5 times, every 10 times, every 20 times, every 8 times. It doesn't have that consistency. It changes up. And for a fixed interval schedule, the subject receives the reward after a fixed amount of time, no matter what. So again, we get that consistency like we got with the first one, but it deals with time instead of the amount of occurrences. So every 10 times, the subject gets their reward, no matter if they only performed the behavior 1 time or 5 times. They still get that same reward after those 10 minutes is up. And then the last one, variable interval schedule, is the amount of time in between rewards changes. So again, we don't get that same consistency that we got with the last one. That time frame changes. So we could have every 10 minutes, every 20 minutes, every hour, or even every week like that. The time is inconsistent and just keeps changing. Right, I think that sums up our discussion on the 2 types of behavioral learning theories, which again were the classical conditioning and operant conditioning. Right, have a good one, you guys.